You have been waiting for something, not dramatically, not consciously, in a way you would admit to if someone asked, but somewhere beneath the ordinary movement of your days, beneath the work and the relationships and the routines, there has been a waiting. For the person who would finally understand you completely, for the circumstances to arrange themselves into something that made the next step obvious, for the recognition that would confirm you were on the right path, for someone to notice how much you had been carrying and offer to carry some of it, for something to arrive that would make the life you have been living feel genuinely yours rather than the life that accumulated around you while you were waiting for something else. This waiting does not look like waiting from the outside. It looks like patience, like loyalty, like the reasonable maintenance of hope in the face of circumstances that have not yet delivered what they seem to promise. It is not until something shifts, quietly, without announcement, in a moment that feels more like settling than like revelation, that you begin to see it for what it was. Carl Jung spent decades studying what happens to people who are living, to various degrees, inside this particular form of waiting. And what he observed was not what the comforting narrative around hope and perseverance tends to suggest. He did not find that waiting was eventually rewarded by the arrival of what was waited for. He found something more disturbing and more useful than that. He found that the waiting itself was the structure that was preventing what the person most needed from becoming available. And that the moment the waiting stopped, genuinely, not as a strategy for producing the thing waited for, but as the honest recognition that the thing was not coming in the form that had been imagined, something became possible that had not been possible while the waiting continued. This video is about that moment, and about what Jung believed it actually liberates. To understand what the waiting is, you have to understand the psychological structure it is built from, because it is not simply impatience dressed as patience. It is something more specific than that. Jung identified a pattern that he observed with remarkable consistency across very different people in very different circumstances. A pattern he understood not as a personal failing, but as a developmental stage, one that is nearly universal in its occurrence. And that has a specific and identifiable cause. The pattern was this: a significant portion of the person's psychological life was organized around an expectation that had never been made fully conscious. The expectation that something external, a person, a recognition, a circumstance, a form of love, would arrive and resolve something internal. Something that the person could not yet see clearly enough to address directly. Something they did not yet have adequate language for. Something that felt, from the inside, less like a wound that needed treatment, and more like a gap that needed filling. The gap was real. The need it represented was genuine. What was not accurate was the belief about what would fill it, and about where the filling would come from. Jung traced this pattern back, in most of the people he worked with, to the earliest relationships, to the specific quality of what was and was not available in the environments where the self was first forming. Not always through dramatic failure of care, often through the ordinary, unremarkable limitations of people who were doing what they could with what they had, but leaving, nevertheless, certain needs unmet, in ways that the child had no framework to address directly, and so the child did what children do. It adapted, it waited, it developed the implicit belief that if the right conditions could be arranged, if the right person could be found, if the right response could be earned, the unmet need would finally be met, and the waiting that began there never quite ended. It simply changed its external form. The specific person or circumstance being waited for changed as the person moved through the stages of their life. But the underlying structure remained, the orientation towards something arriving from outside that would resolve something that lived inside. The people who surrounded the waiting person often participated in it without realizing they were participating. Because the waiting produces something that looks like its opposite. It produces people who give more than they receive, who work harder than the situation requires, who are more present, more attentive, more emotionally available than most people around them. This looks like strength, like generosity, like the admirable quality of someone who has more to offer than the average person. And in one sense, it is all of those things. But it is also the operation of an unconscious logic. The logic that says if I give enough, if I remain available enough, if I demonstrate clearly enough that I am worth being saved, then eventually the saving will arrive. That the investment of effort and care and emotional labor will eventually produce the reciprocal investment that the waiting was organized around receiving. This logic fails. Not always immediately, not in a way that produces a single clear moment of recognition, but gradually, through accumulated evidence, through the repeated experience of the investment not producing the expected return, of the care not generating the reciprocal care, of the availability not producing the recognition of what the availability was costing. And the failure is not random, it is structural. The logic fails because the structure of human relationship does not work the way the waiting assumes it works. People do not respond to emotional investment with reciprocal emotional investment as a reliable matter of cause and effect. They respond based on their own psychological structures, their own needs, their own wounds, their own capacity in any given moment for the kind of presence the person waiting for rescue was hoping to receive. And most people, most of the time, are so thoroughly occupied with the operation of their own interior that the emotional investment of others registers primarily as something convenient, something that meets a need they have, rather than as something that generates an obligation toward the person providing it. Jung observed this with the precision of someone who had watched the pattern play out enough times to understand its mechanics, and his conclusion was not that people were fundamentally selfish. It was that the expectation was built on a misunderstanding of how human psychological life operates, and that the misunderstanding was not correctable by finding better people. It was only correctable by seeing the misunderstanding itself. The moment of seeing is what the title of this video refers to, and it deserves careful description, because it is not the dramatic rupture that the phrase "the day you realize" suggests. It does not arrive as a sudden insight that reorganizes everything in a single morning. It arrives more quietly than that, as an exhaustion, a specific quality of tiredness that is different from the ordinary tiredness of difficult circumstances. The tiredness of someone who has been maintaining a particular orientation for a very long time, who has been managing the continued hope, the continued expectation, the continued adjustment of the self toward a form that might finally produce the desired response, and who has reached a point where the management is no longer sustainable. Not because circumstances have become worse, because something in the psyche has recognized, below the level of conscious articulation, that the management has not been working, that the investment has not been producing the return, that the waiting has been the primary organizing principle of a significant portion of their emotional life, and that it has been organizing that life around something that was not going to arrive in the form that was being waited for. This recognition does not produce immediate peace. Jung was honest about this. The initial experience of it is closer to grief than to liberation, because what is being recognized as not coming is something that was genuinely needed. The need was real. The longing for it was not pathological. The unmet need that the waiting was organized around was the accurate perception of something that was genuinely absent and genuinely mattered. What was not accurate was the belief that the specific external form being waited for was the only way the need could be addressed, and what the grief of this recognition makes available, once it has been genuinely moved through, rather than immediately converted back into waiting, is exactly the question that the waiting had been preventing. If the thing I was waiting for is not coming in the form I imagined, what actually is available to address what I genuinely need? Jung's answer to this question was not simple, and it was not comfortable in the way that answers to this question tend to be made comfortable by the frameworks that surround healing and self-development. He did not say that everything you need is already inside you, though there is something true in that direction. He did not say that self-love is the answer, though that phrase, when it means something specific rather than something general, points toward part of what he was describing. What he said was more precise and more demanding than either of those formulations. He said that what the person who stops waiting encounters is themselves, not a better version of themselves, not the self that would have developed if the circumstances had been kinder or the people around them more available. The actual self, as it currently is, with all its wounds and adaptations and suppressed material and conditioned reflexes. The self that developed inside the waiting, that was shaped by it, formed by it, organized around it, and that is now, for the first time perhaps, being encountered directly, without the mediation of the expectation that someone or something was going to arrive and make the direct encounter unnecessary. This encounter is not pleasant in its early stages, because what the direct encounter reveals is not flattering. It reveals the degree to which the self that developed inside the waiting was organized around the waiting, around the unconscious expectation of rescue, around the performance of qualities calculated to produce the desired response, around the suppression of aspects of genuine experience that conflicted with the version of the self most likely to be saved, the anger that was incompatible with the presentation, the needs that were too large to be admitted, the honest assessment of certain relationships that would have been too painful to act on, while the hope of their transformation was still alive. All of this becomes visible when the waiting stops, and the visibility is uncomfortable before it is liberating. The liberation Jung described is not the comfortable liberation of having been rescued from something. It is the more demanding liberation of no longer needing rescue in the way that was previously imagined. And this distinction is significant, because the two feel entirely different from the inside. The first kind of liberation, the kind that comes from being rescued, produces relief. The specific relief of a pressure that has been removed by something external. It feels like arriving somewhere after a long journey, like being able to rest because someone else has taken the weight. It feels good. Immediately and unmistakably good, but it does not last, because the structure that was producing the need for rescue remains intact, and so the need eventually regenerates, and the waiting begins again, with a new person or a new circumstance, or a new form of recognition in the role of potential rescuer. The second kind of liberation, the kind Jung was describing, produces something different, something that does not feel like relief in the immediate sense, something that feels, at first, like the absence of something that was providing comfort even while it was causing suffering, the absence of the hope, the absence of the expectation, the absence of the particular quality of anticipation that organized the days, and in the absence of all of that, a specific quality of quiet, not peaceful exactly, not the warm quiet of arrival, the more neutral quiet of a person who has stopped moving in a direction they were always moving in, who is standing still for perhaps the first time, and beginning to notice what is actually present, rather than what was expected to arrive. What is actually present, when the waiting stops and the quiet settles, and the person finally turns toward their own life, without the organizing framework of the expectation, is usually surprising. Not in the dramatic sense of discovering hidden resources or previously inaccessible strengths, in the quieter sense of finding that the self, the actual, unidealized, currently existing self, is more substantial than the waiting had allowed it to appear. Because the waiting had a specific effect on the self's apparent weight. It made it seem lighter than it was, less capable of standing on its own, more dependent on external support than was actually the case. This was not incidental. The waiting required the self to appear insufficient. Because if the self were genuinely sufficient, if what was needed could be generated internally rather than received from outside, the waiting would have no justification. The unconscious logic of the rescue fantasy depends on maintaining a certain picture of the self. The picture of someone who needs something they do not currently have, who cannot fully function without the thing being waited for, whose life is incomplete in a specific way that only the expected arrival can complete. And this picture, maintained over years, becomes a kind of self-fulfilling architecture. Not because the self is actually incapable, but because the energy that would have gone toward developing its own capacities has been directed toward the waiting, toward the management of hope, toward the performance of qualities designed to produce the desired response, toward the maintenance of relationships that were being experienced through the lens of their potential to provide what was waited for. When this energy is no longer directed outward, when the waiting stops and the orientation shifts, the self discovers resources it did not know it had. Not because they suddenly appeared, because they are now available. Jung described the shadow in this context with considerable precision, and what he found in the shadow of people organized around the rescue fantasy was specific. It was not primarily rage or envy, or the darker emotional material that tends to dominate popular accounts of shadow work. It was capability, the specific capability that the waiting had made it psychologically threatening to develop. Because a person who develops genuine self-sufficiency, who cultivates the capacity to provide for their own needs rather than depending on external provision, undermines the premise of the rescue fantasy. And the rescue fantasy, for someone deeply organized around it, has the quality of an identity. It is not just a hope. It is the structure around which much of the personality has been built. To develop self-sufficiency is, in a specific sense, to threaten that structure, and the psyche resists threats to its organizing structures with considerable force. So the capability stayed in the shadow, the genuine competence, the actual resilience, the capacity for self-direction that had always been there, but that the waiting required to remain underdeveloped. Because as long as the capability remained underdeveloped, the need for rescue remained credible. And as long as the need for rescue remained credible, the waiting could continue. And the waiting, for all its cost, had been providing something that felt necessary. The sense of being connected to something beyond the current self, to a future in which things would be different, to a story in which the current difficulty was temporary, and the arrival of what was waited for would transform everything. The shadow contained the capability, and the integration of that capability, the willingness to develop what had been kept underdeveloped, is what the stopping of the waiting makes available. The practical consequences of this integration are specific enough to describe, not in the aspirational sense of what becomes possible in principle, in the observable sense of what actually changes in the person's daily experience. The first change is in the relationship to other people. Not a wholesale transformation of how you experience others, but a specific and significant shift in what you are primarily reading for in them. When the waiting is active, other people are assessed, unconsciously, automatically, before any conscious evaluation, for their potential to provide what is being waited for. Every new relationship is scanned for the possibility that this person might be the one. Every existing relationship is monitored for signs of movement toward or away from the desired provision. Every interaction carries the weight of its potential contribution to the rescue. When the waiting stops, this assessment drops away, not all at once, not permanently and without regression, but gradually and with increasing stability. And what replaces it is a quality of attention that was not previously available, because the attention was occupied, taken up by the scanning, by the continuous monitoring of everyone around you for their potential to provide what was waited for. When that scanning stops, something becomes possible that it was preventing. Genuine interest in the person themselves, not in their potential to rescue, not in what they might provide, in who they actually are. And this genuine interest, available for perhaps the first time in the full sense, changes the quality of every relationship, not necessarily making each one warmer, but making each one more real, less about what the other person might eventually become or provide, more about what is actually present between two actual people. The second change is in the relationship to the self. Jung observed that people organized around the rescue fantasy often have a specific quality of self-relationship. They know themselves primarily through their performance, through how they appear to others, through the qualities they have developed in service of making themselves rescuable. But the self beneath the performance, the self that exists when no one is watching, and no impression is being managed, and no response is being calibrated toward a desired outcome, is largely unknown to them. Not because it is absent, because the attention has never been sufficiently directed toward it, has always been primarily outward, toward others, toward the waiting, toward the management of hope. When the waiting stops and the outward orientation begins to shift, the inward territory becomes more accessible. And what is found there is frequently different from what was anticipated. The person who feared that without the hope of rescue there would be nothing, that the absence of the expectation would reveal an emptiness at the center of their experience, finds instead that there is someone there, someone with genuine preferences, genuine reactions, genuine assessments of situations that had been overridden in the service of maintaining relationships organized around the rescue fantasy, genuine anger at things that warranted anger, genuine satisfaction in things that had value independent of anyone's recognition of that value, genuine direction, not the borrowed direction of the goal of being rescued, but something quieter and more specific, a sense of what actually matters to this particular person, independent of what would impress, independent of what would produce the desired response, independent of what would make the case for rescue more compelling. Simply what matters. The third change is the most significant and the least expected. It is a change in the experience of other people's limitations. When the waiting is active, The limitations of the people around you have a specific quality. They feel like failures, like evidence that the person you were depending on is not the right one. Like disappointment that redirects the waiting toward a different candidate, or like confirmation of a darker version of the rescue fantasy, the belief that no one is capable of providing what is needed, that the need is too large, that something about you makes genuine rescue impossible. When the waiting stops, the limitations of others lose this quality entirely. They stop being failures or confirmations of impossibility. They become simply what they are, the finite capacity of finite people, doing what they can with what they have, in the same way that you are doing what you can with what you have. Neither failing you nor saving you, simply being themselves. And this shift, from experiencing others through the lens of their potential to rescue or their failure to rescue, to experiencing them as simply themselves, produces something in relationships that the waiting never could: genuine meeting. Two people who are both themselves, neither organized primarily around providing something to the other, neither being assessed primarily for their potential to provide something. Present to each other in a way that the waiting, with its continuous assessment and its continuous performance, was always partially preventing. Jung wrote about what he called the confrontation with the self as among the most significant experiences available in a human life, and he was careful to distinguish between the self as an idealized concept and the self as it is actually encountered. The encounter is not with the best version of you. It is with the version that actually exists, the one shaped by everything that happened, by the waiting and the adapting and the suppressing and the performing, the one that carries the accumulated record of years of orienting itself primarily toward something that was not coming in the form imagined. This self is not impressive in the way that the self sought through the rescue fantasy was imagined to be. The rescue fantasy imagined that the arrival of what was waited for would produce a transformed self, healed, whole, finally capable of living the life that the rescue would make possible. The self actually encountered when the waiting stops is not that self. It is the current self, with all its current limitations and accumulated adaptations and in-progress processes, not yet transformed, not yet healed in any completed sense, simply present, available for a different kind of engagement with its own experience than the engagement the waiting permitted. And from that presence, from that availability, something becomes possible that was not possible while the waiting continued. Not transformation in the dramatic sense. Development in the quiet, incremental, genuinely sustainable sense. The development that can only occur when the energy previously directed toward the waiting is redirected toward the actual life currently being lived. There is something Jung observed about the people who had moved through this transition that is worth describing carefully. Because the cultural narrative around this kind of shift tends to frame it as the acquisition of independence, of self-sufficiency, of the ability to need nothing from anyone. Jung's observation was more nuanced than that. The people who had genuinely stopped waiting did not become self-contained. They did not stop wanting connection, did not stop finding value in being understood by others, did not develop an indifference to the quality of their relationships. What changed was not the desire for connection, it was the desperation of it, the quality of need that had made every relationship a candidate for the rescue. That had assessed every person for their potential to provide what had not yet arrived. That had made the self-stability contingent on the response of others in a way that was always precarious and always exhausting. When the waiting stopped, the desire for connection remained, but it was freed from the desperation that had been distorting it. And freed from that distortion, it could find something that the desperation had always been preventing: actual connection, with people who were themselves, in relationships that did not require either party to be something other than what they were, to provide something they were not actually capable of providing, to fulfill a role in a rescue narrative they had never auditioned for. This is what the liberation actually produces, not the independence that needs nothing, the presence that can receive what is actually available, rather than remaining organized around what was imagined and waited for. Carl Jung believed that the confrontation with this reality, the moment of recognizing that nobody is coming in the form imagined, and that the self is more capable than the waiting required it to appear, was not a failure, not the sad endpoint of a hope that should have been maintained, but the beginning of something that the hope had been delaying, the beginning of a life, actually lived rather than organized around the anticipation of a life that would begin once the rescue arrived. The beginning of relationships actually entered rather than assessed for their rescue potential. The beginning of a self actually developed rather than maintained in the particular configuration most likely to earn the saving. The most liberating truth he documented across decades of this work was not a truth about human strength or resilience, or the capacity to survive difficulty. It was a truth about what becomes available when the waiting stops, not as a matter of giving up, as a matter of finally turning toward what is actually present, toward the life that is actually here, toward the people who are actually available, toward the self that actually exists, right now, without rescue, without the arrival that was waited for. And discovering that this, the actual, currently existing, unrescued life, is considerably more than the waiting allowed it to appear. If something in this landed in a specific place, leave one word in the comments that describes what you have been waiting for, because naming it is sometimes the beginning of no longer needing it to arrive from somewhere outside yourself.